The voices of New Brunswick writers are the heart of WordCraft, a podcast aimed at creating community through words. WordCraft is a creation of the Writers Federation of New Brunswick, a nonprofit organization that helps New Brunswick writers to write, acquire skills, and showcase their talents to the world. The show is hosted and produced by Jenna Morton, with technical production by Tosh Taylor. The WFNB acknowledges that the land on which we live, work, and gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik and Mi'kmaq Peoples. We honor the spirit of our ancestors' treaties of peace and friendship. We acknowledge the support of Arts Culture NB.
Robert J. Sawyer is perhaps Canada's most decorated science fiction writer. He has 25 novels published, is a prolific contributor to magazines and anthologies, and he's received the Hugo Award, the Nebula Award, the John W. Campbell Memorial Award, and multiple Aurora Awards, among many other accolades. He's also the keynote speaker and workshop leader at this year's WordSpring, the Writers Federation of New Brunswick's annual gathering that's going to happen May 29th and 30th, 2026, right here in St. John. And in advance of his visit to New Brunswick, he has joined us here on the podcast. Welcome to WordCraft.
Hi, Jenna. Delighted to be here.
Thank you so much. I know that people are really excited about you coming to give the keynote. Give us just without giving it away, a little hint of what people can expect to hear you talk about when you're here in the spring.
Well, the title of my keynote is Facing the Future, New Horizons in Publishing, What It Means to Be a Writer, and the Promise and Peril of AI, of artificial intelligence. And that indeed is what I'm going to be talking about. My first novel came out in 1990, so that's 36 years ago as of this year. And the publishing industry has completely transformed itself in that more than a third of a century. And we're facing really an existential threat towards the livelihood of writers and the viability of traditional publishing, thanks to large language models and their ability to ape or mimic human creativity, to spew out material based on what they had vacuumed up off of the internet. As it happens this afternoon, when we're recording this, I was in the process of filling out my class action claim against Anthropic, which had scraped from a pirate website the copyrighted works of myself and thousands of my writing colleagues across the globe to feed into their large language model so that it could plagiarize and spit out duplicates or riffs upon the fruits of human intellectual labor. So I'm going to be talking about that and whether there's a way for those of us who like to toil over the keyboard and produce our own text to still make a living in what's left of the 21st century.
It must be such an extra kind of dilemma for someone who has lived in the world of science fiction writing and science in general to kind of have seen, you must almost feel like a canary in the coal mine that no one was listening to sometimes, I think.
The phrase I use is Cassandra screaming. And in fact, that's the working title for a forthcoming collection of my own nonfiction writings about science fiction. Cassandra, of course, was the female prophet in Greek mythology who was doubly cursed to be able to see the future, and doubly cursed that nobody would believe her about what she said was going to happen, even though it absolutely was going to happen. The science fiction writer has had that double curse since the beginning of our art form. We've been warning vociferously about the advent of AI. This is 2026. Well, 1968 was the year that 2001: A Space Odyssey came out with the murdering artificial intelligence HAL 9000, voiced by the great Canadian actor Douglas Rain. Prior to that, we've been warning about AI. Subsequent to that, we've been warning about AI. And yet nobody, A, seemed to pay attention, and B, when it got here, everybody said, well, why didn't anybody tell us? Why weren't we warned? So yes, I used to have a full head of hair. I'm now completely bald from ripping my hair out at the roots in frustration, because not just myself, but my colleagues for generations have been sounding warning bells about artificial intelligence, climate degradation, income inequality, the rise of authoritarianism. 10 years ago this month, I had a novel come out from Penguin Canada called Quantum Night about a psychopathic US president who decides to annex Canada. The warning was out there. And right now, we still face a very real possibility that the president of the United States will declare national security as a reason to simply march across the world's largest undefended border and take the true north, no longer strong, no longer free. So all of this resonates. But in terms of what we originally talked about, artificial intelligence, I had a trilogy also from Penguin Canada, Wake, Watch, and Wonder, about the World Wide Web gaining consciousness. But my nascent AI spoke with, yea, verily, and how art thou? Because it had had the ethics to only scrape public domain text, most of which is, early 20th century, 19th century, or before. And so, at a very Victorian way of speaking, because it had taken the text that was freely and ethically available for AI to digest, to learn to speak English and all the other languages of the world. I did not contemplate the perfidy, the incredible rapaciousness, the evil of the big corporations who would simply say, yeah, we can make a lot of money by stealing the intellectual output of millions of creators, not just writers, but also artists, musicians, you name it. We'll just steal all that and regurgitate it and sell that regurgitation as if we were the creators. So I'm going to talk about all of that in my keynote. The existential threat, and if there is a way for writers to survive. I have some answers.
Well, I was just going to say, how do you stay hopeful and how do you keep creating in this kind of climate?
It is a really difficult climate. One of my great friends is another Canadian science fiction writer named Spider Robinson. Used to live in Atlantic Canada, but now long has lived in British Columbia. And he said to me a couple of years ago, Rob, we got in at the right time, that is, into professional publishing of genre fiction. We made out like bandits, that is, we made a good living, and we're getting out at the right time because the era in which there could be a full-time professional writer in Canada or even the United States, England, the Western world, may be coming to an end in terms of you can be full-time if somebody else is supporting you, but full-time and making a living and being able to support a family based on it may be coming to an end. We have to fight every step of the way to make sure that our rights are respected, that the notion of copyright isn't just sloughed off as an inefficiency from the past in our unbridled, and not our, but the big five tech corporations' unbridled desire to make money regardless of the ethics of it. Also, as we're talking today, Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, is in court right now facing a lawsuit that says they deliberately designed their products to be addictive to young people. And they may face damages for that, or they may dodge the bullet. So right now, it's really very much the courts are going to decide the future of the creative arts. And it behooves us all to be paying great attention to that and reminding our legislative representatives here in Canada and our colleagues in the United States and Europe and so forth, their representatives, that these are existential issues, not just for writers and creators, but for civilization. The arts are the signature of civilization.
How do you kind of find peace and balance in that idea, whether it's in real life or, in the fictional worlds that you create, where you find a harmony between using the technology that we've created and keeping humanity and creativity?
You don't have to use that technology. There's no obligation because, well, it's here, you have to use it. No, you don't. We don't use chlorofluorocarbons anymore because they put an ozone hole in. We took asbestos out of our walls because even though it was the best insulation we had, it also was carcinogenic. We stopped using DDT. There are endless numbers of technologies where in the past we have said, oh, or and the existential one of them all, the atomic bomb, which was only used twice in combat, both times in first strike situations by the United States. We haven't used it since. It was 1945, the last time anybody used atomic weapons. So that's 81 years ago this year. We don't have to embrace this technology. Somebody said to me recently, well, if we, meaning the West, don't win the AI war, China will win. And I said to that person, what will they win? Putting hundreds of millions of Chinese out of work and having somehow the government either find a way for them to be supported through the largesse of the government or for them to starve, to make despondent their entire creative class. What will they win if they win this? And of course, the response, I don't know what they'll win. I just have heard that we have to win this race instead. I don't think we do. I do not use any AI-related technologies in assisting me in my composition. Of course, I use a spell checker, but a spell checker is something that we've had since the 1990s, actually 1980s. I remember when the first ever computerized spell checker for personal computers became available. That is qualitatively different than something telling me that I don't know how to spell ukulele or ophthalmologist is qualitatively different than something telling me, you know, that sentence you wrote about the ukulele playing ophthalmologist, it would be so much more mellifluous if it was phrased this way. That is a bridge too far and a line that no writer should cross.
I think that's such a perfect way to describe that conundrum of the uses of technology. I'm wondering, kind of switching gears a little bit, thinking of your work as, a futurist, as someone who tends to write not too far in the future with your work. At the speed at which things are changing, does it become more difficult for you to write about the future? I'm wondering how that's shifted for you over the decades.
So a science fiction work can only be judged by the year in which it was published. I just actually was talking to one of my doctors today, and he said, "Oh, I'm halfway through your novel, The Terminal Experiment." Well, The Terminal Experiment was published in 1995, which is 31 years ago now, and set in 2011, which is 15 years ago now, and won science fiction's top award, the Nebula Award from the Science Fiction Fantasy Writers of America. But clearly, a lot of my detailed portrayal, even of 2011, turned out to not be how 2011 really was, let alone how the world is today in 2025. But my prognostications were plausible in 1995, and many of them did come true. So I don't worry about it, although I do have a number of colleagues who have abandoned the notion of writing near future science fiction because they're afraid, especially if they're traditionally published. If I were to finish a book today, it would likely be, and even if it was under contract to my traditional publisher, it would be a year before it was in stores. And that's for a novel under contract by an author that they fast track through the process. If you're finishing a book today for traditional publishing, it's going to be a year or more before you sell it. And for authors that aren't front list authors, probably 2 years after that before it's in stores, 3 years after you finished it. Well, the world 3 years ago, we didn't have large language models. We didn't have ChatGPT. We didn't have many of these technologies. And anything you wrote 3 years ago is therefore obsolete in the world today. It's more nimble to be, if you're writing near future science fiction, a self-published author these days. And when I started off, of course, that was Vanity Press, nobody did it. Now it's a very respectable way to do it. And you are always trying to beat the onslaught of the future that's rushing headlong towards us. Science and technology advances not at a linear rate, but an exponential rate. But we have to get people engaged in the dialogues about the changes that are coming very soon down the pike. I think it's much more important to write about new reproductive technologies, the technologies that will prolong the human lifespan in the next decade, artificial intelligence, robotics, bioethics, than it is to write about conundrums involving warp drive, teleportation, and interstellar travel. which are far, far down the road and therefore not really existential issues to be dealt with. I like to write existential fiction that deals with the things that threaten our very existence. And if it doesn't threaten our actual existence, threatens our emotional well-being, our sense of self-worth. Science fiction is a very important part of that dialogue, even though we end up more often getting to say simply, I told you so, than, whew, thank goodness you listened and we avoided that crisis.
Well, I did come across a quote from you online when I was preparing to have this interview, and it was a quote that said, I quoted you as saying, the role of the science fiction writer isn't to be a cheerleader for technology, it's to be its critic. And
Yes.
I was wondering, what are some of the things that you are critiquing right now?
Sure. First, I just want to elaborate on the quote for a moment. Obviously, everybody who writes science fiction is somewhat technophilic. We love technology, or we wouldn't be writing about that. We write about robots, we write about AI, we write about starships and spaceships and Mars colonies and all those interesting things, genetic manipulation, and all sorts of things. But the people who make those technologies want you to buy them. And they have a fiduciary obligation to their shareholders or to their bosses who have an obligation to the shareholders to maximize the profit by minimizing any downsides for their technology. So they, the Googles, the Microsofts, the NVIDIAs of the world, exist to tell you how wonderful their technology is. And it is the job of the science fiction writer to say, hang on a minute. You may have thought through the first order ramification of what you're doing, but what about the second, third, and fourth order ramifications? What about the unintended consequences of what you're trying to foist onto the human race? And our job is to look with a very skeptical eye at changes in science and technology. And if something is good and wonderful, and for instance, AI is by far the best tool for detecting breast cancer in mammograms, far better than any human radiologist. We should embrace that because breast cancer is an enormous scourge, and anything that leads to earlier detection saves valuable human lives. There are certainly uses for AI, but our job is to look at the upside and the downside. The thing that, again, we're so much enamored with AI right now, or government businesses, that I'm certainly looking at that with the most jaundice of eyes right now, and all of the potential downsides involved with that. But also, the very first science fiction novel in 1818 was written by a woman. It was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And she was looking fundamentally at new reproductive technologies. How can you make new life? And well, if Dr. Frankenstein Victor makes a new life form, or at least reanimates a life form, and also about the politics of men rather than women controlling the creative act. Frankenstein becomes a tragedy because Dr. Frankenstein, or Victor Frankenstein, cares not one whit what happens after that moment of creation to the thing that he has created, the abandonment of the paternal responsibility. And here we are today looking at new reproductive technologies, and in many regimes around the world, including very much the United States today, men trying to claw back women's reproductive freedom. Margaret Atwood, of course, the great Canadian colleague of mine, science fiction writer. Hi, Margaret. Hi. You write science fiction. Talked about all this starting 40 years ago in 1985 with Handmaid's Tale. She wasn't the first. Ursula K. Le Guin, Judith Merril, many others, and men as well, were writing about these issues well prior to that. But she certainly started sounding the warning bells. And as Margaret would say, and many a science fiction writer would say, yeah, but it wasn't intended to be an instruction manual. It was supposed to be a warning text.
What do you think are those topics that are ripe for exploration in your genre right now?
We are very close, in all likelihood, to a radical extension of the length of the human lifespan. Most of the causes of aging have been identified: the buildup of free radicals, the breakdown of DNA as the telomeres, which are the end caps on DNA, on chromosomes are eroded, and so forth. We're getting more and more better technologies for uh, retarding and ultimately reversing these things. And so we've got to look at what's going to happen when people don't shuffle off this mortal coil. The biblical, I had a friend who just died. He just died at 76. Tragic. We all say far too young. And yet 100 years ago, he'd beaten the biblical 70 by a good 6 years. He was a hale age, a wonderful achievement to live that long. So one of the things I'm very interested in is life prolongation. I happen to be 65. I don't know that I'm going to live anything longer than a natural lifespan. But my nieces and nephews, their children, the second and third generation behind me, might very well live 200 or more years. Well, what do we do in terms of resource allocation? What do we do in terms of the scarcity of meaningful pursuits they're going to be? Do you have a right to hold on to a job for 90 years if you're going to live to be 120? Or will you have an obligation to take mandatory retirement at 65 simply because there aren't enough meaningful vocations or even avocations left for human beings in the wake of AI, for somebody to squander one for most of a century instead of turning it over and giving somebody else a chance to be the basketball player or the novelist or the lawyer or the doctor or even the accountant or the caretaker. I think those issues are very ripe for speculation right now.
What is it that you like to read for entertainment, for pleasure?
So I'm a science fiction writer by profession, which means that I don't read a lot of science fiction anymore. I just did finish a novel, Fleet of Worlds by Larry David and Edward Lerner, two good friends of mine, for instance, and another one, The Headmasters by Mark Morton, a fine Canadian science fiction writer. I read some science fiction still, but by and large, I read far more crime fiction and mystery fiction because otherwise my whole life would be science fiction. Of course, I'm a voracious reader of nonfiction on every conceivable topic. Right now, I'm reading the book Strata, which is about sedimentation. It was one of my friend Dan Falk, the great Canadian science journalist's picks for the top 10 science books of last year, of 2025. So I read voraciously in all kinds of nonfiction. I'm also reading a book called Five Germanys I Have Known, about how the culture of Germany has changed from the beginning of the 20th century through to today. But most of my novel reading is crime or mystery fiction. It prizes the intellectual process, picking up clues, ratiocination, figuring out what's going on. So it's allied to science fiction in that way. They're both rational, puzzle-solving genres, but it gets me away from the tropes and settings that would make my whole life being about being a science fiction person.
I always find it fascinating to know what people are reading on their own time because, like you say, especially when you're in the writing profession, you don't want to be reading work when you need to disconnect. So
exactly.
Thinking about, how people get into the profession and, particularly, I think with science fiction, historically, a lot of people, found inroads through magazines for many genres, not just science fiction. But how do you think someone can break into the genre these days? What advice do you have? What path do you see for the people who are just coming up to take over and to fill those spaces?
Well, of course, there are paths, plural, these days: traditional publishing and self-publishing. For the traditional publishing route, it hasn't really changed much. The way I started, the way about 80% of the working pros in science fiction or the other genre categories, mystery being another great example, got their start writing short fiction for short fiction markets. The short fiction markets don't pay very well. The quote unquote professional rate in science fiction, as defined by the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association, of which decades ago I was president, is 8 cents US a word, which is peanuts compared to what any nonfiction magazine would pay, and peanuts compared to what, if you work out what most novelists make for their published words, they make an order of magnitude, or if they're lucky, 2 orders or 3 orders of magnitude more than that per word. So what that means is those markets are always hungry for new talent, because after people have kind of made a name in there and graduated to book publishing, then there's a vacuum that needs to be filled by people coming up. It's still a very effective way to either publish in one of the print magazines in science fiction, fantasy, or horror or mystery. Most people know the names in mystery, Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, Edward Queen's Mystery Magazine. In science fiction, Asimov's Science Fiction and Analog Science Fiction, the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. After a consolidation last year, by the way, all 5 of those are owned by the same company now, called Must Read Magazines, and they're also fine online publications in the science fiction and fantasy field and in mystery field. Get a credential or 2 or 3 in there, approach a literary agent with your novel manuscript, and go into traditional publishing. The other route is just dive into self-publishing. You don't have to have any pre-publication credentials, and nobody but you has to have decided that you're any good before you come to the marketplace. Now, the reality is you will not find an audience if you aren't any good. But if you are good, absolutely, you can dive in to self-publishing. Make sure you've got a well-edited manuscript, either professionally well-edited. You can hire very good freelance editors. The Editors Association of Canada will help steer you to a bona fide credentialed editor if you're looking to hire one, or simply having a really good critique group that you belong to, and also you yourself memorizing not just Strunk White's Elements of Style, but the Chicago Manual of Style. You should know as a writer where a semicolon goes and when you use an em dash, and the difference between that and which. And if you don't know the difference between that and which, you've got work to do. But a carpenter knows the difference between all the different types of nails and screws and screwdrivers and knows where they go. A writer says, I'm too creative to worry about punctuation. Grammar is actually just sloppy at what they do, and that will hurt them if they try to self-publish. Traditionally publish, a copy editor will come along and clean up the mess you've made on your manuscript if necessary, but nobody is happy dealing with a sloppy writer, even in traditional publishing. But you can, yes, absolutely, good cover art. A great Canadian company named Bibliophile Designs in Red Deer, Alberta, is doing covers for my publisher most recently. And there are other very fine cover designers. Cover art matters, should not be AI generated. Don't use AI, it taints you. If you stand around and say, well, oh yeah, I had AI do my book cover. Oh, and I had them narrate my book too. My audiobook, AI narrated. My ebook and my print book, AI cover. Well, when they came for the cover artists, and you didn't stand up because you weren't a cover artist, and when they came for the narrators, and you didn't stand up because you're not a narrator, don't expect anybody to stand up for you when they come for the book authors, which large language models is going to make extraordinarily easy for them to say, oh yeah, you want a book like Robert Sawyer's books, but without all of the stupid puns and Star Trek references? Yeah, here it is. Because we read them all. We pirated and read every one of Rob's books and can ape his style and give you what you want. Bespoke fiction is going to be the future of micro-publishing. You'll just say, I want a book like Margaret Atwood or like Rob Sawyer or like Dashiell Hammett or whoever it is you happen to like, but with or without these things. Is hold, you can go to a McDonald's, you got to take the burger the way they give it to you. It's going to be the Burger King model. Hold the pickle, hold the lettuce, special orders don't upset us. No profanity, no sex. If you don't like those, or lots of profanity, let's get Margaret Atwood, get really down and dirty, right? In the books, all of that can be generated almost instantaneously by large language models now. And nobody will shed a tear for you, the author. One of the things I hate about online streaming services is they cut away from the credits whenever you're watching a movie or a TV show, because it behooves the owners of those companies to have people forget that human beings created the art they were watching, because they want to sell you computer-generated art. We don't need to see the names of the writers, directors, actors, grips, technicians, catering people, because it is way more in the interests of the Netflix and the Amazons of the world for you to not care that there was a human being in the loop, so they don't have to compensate a human being as they continue their fire hose approach to providing content to the masses.
What a fascinating way to think about that. I'm one of those people who always flicks and says, no, watch the credits because I like to read through them and see who was involved. But I didn't think
Yes,
about it in terms of that being one of the reasons that they don't want you to watch them. It's not that they're just trying to get you to watch the next thing.
they don't want you to linger. And they also really don't want you to think. And this is very much, when they say in 5, 4, 3, the next thing is starting, right? You could watch something extraordinarily powerful, like To Kill a Mockingbird, one of the greatest films ever made, or also a great book, of course. And you get to the end, and you should stop and think about the message of that film, which is that a person of color, even provably incapable of having committed the crime they're accused of, still can't get a fair shake out of the American justice system. That's something you should think about while the theme music of To Kill a Mockingbird plays and the credits slowly roll. And you should possibly stop and talk to somebody that you watched the film with about the issue. But no, the model is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and now here is Legally Blonde 2 immediately following. And you have no reflection. It is simply constantly stealing your attention and stealing your ability to reflect on what you've seen and stealing your ability to pay homage to the creators that have given you the joy or information or entertainment you've just consumed by taking away their bow. In live theater, you wait till the actors come out at the end. They get their bow. You applaud them. And it's not just polite because they're there in person. You are paying back. You're acknowledging that there was an artist. And at the end, what do the actors always do? If the playwright is there, they indicate the playwright, they indicate the orchestra leader, they indicate the director, and you understand that art was a human activity. The media conglomerates want you to think that art is not a human activity at all. And it certainly is something we don't want you to stop and think about. We just want you to watch, the opium of the masses.
Before we wrap things up, let's bring it back to a more hopeful note. And what do you think, keeping that in mind though, what do you think the writers of right now need to be doing to protect their work and to ensure that we continue to have writers and readers for generations to come?
The worst thing a writer can do is be fungible, be interchangeable with any of infinite number of other writers. The thing that is going to survive, if anything does, is unique voices, unique approaches. The publishing industry for the last few decades has all been all about what they call comps, COMPS, which are comparable titles. So when you go to present your book to an editor goes to present it to the editorial board that'll decide whether or not the publishing company will take on the thing, they have to say, well, it is like Where the Crawdads Sing meets Stephen King's It, or whatever. It has to be a mashup, or this is just like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, except it's set in Czechoslovakia, right? Or it is, in the vein of, in the tradition of. Those are the ones that are not going to be viable because AI can generate them just as easily. The ones that are going to be viable are where you come along. This is unlike anything you have ever read before. Unique voices, intriguing new stories instead of endless sequels. Don't write Star Wars fiction or don't write follow-up fiction. Because it's one of my favorite novels of all time, Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon, I went and got Return of the Maltese Falcon, which just came out just after Maltese Falcon fell into public domain, which it did earlier this year, written by one of the MFMWA, Mr. Writers America, Grandmasters. And man, it wasn't a patch on the original. Second, I would have rather that Grandmaster had gone and written something unique and original. It was almost morbid fascination that caused me to seek it out. We don't need endless sequels, endless reboots, endless reimaginings. We do need new and exciting visions told in unique and interesting voices. One of the nicest things that has come out of the widening of the tent, the bringing in of more diverse voices from more diverse traditions, from somewhere other than the Western European tradition, is not only have we seen new and exciting voices, but we who had been raised solely on the Western canon have been exposed to new ways of thinking, new paradigms, and it will inform our work as well and make it something uniquely human rather than something easily aped by artificial intelligence.
That's a lovely thought. I think that's a perfect place to end our discussion and leave people wanting more to come and hear you at WordSpring. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me tonight.
My absolute pleasure, Jenna. Thank you.
Robert Sawyer is a renowned science fiction author from Ontario. He will be the keynote speaker at this year's WordSpring, the Writers' Federation of New Brunswick's annual gathering that takes place May 29th and 30th in St. John. You can find more information about that on the website WFNB.ca.
WordCraft is a project by the nonprofit Writers' Federation of New Brunswick. The show is hosted and produced by Jenna Morton, with technical production by Tosh Taylor. The Writers' Federation of New Brunswick acknowledges that the land on which we live, work, and gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik and Mi'kmaq Peoples. We honor the spirit of our ancestors' treaties of peace and friendship.
There are many helpers